My field is Paleocontact, and that's the theory that our ancestors in the deep past had contact with other civilizations. And in my travels around the world, as I've looked at the evidences amounting to that conclusion, I've met some amazing people along the way. And I'm going to share a little bit of my conversations with them in this virtual round table. And what I've discovered is that Paleocontact connects with every other discipline you could wish to find. And I realized that for different people, it is different white rabbits that lead them down different rabbit holes to get them to this topic. For some, it might be the white rabbit of looking at the history of political assassinations, and they realize there's a whole other story opening up that they hadn't spotted before. Or for someone else, they're looking at the brain's extra capacity or studying neurological conditions like acquired Savant syndrome. And that opens up a whole question of intelligence, human evolution, question of consciousness. Some people get into questions of consciousness through mystical and shamanic experiences or the study of mystical traditions. Other people, you can look at the history of world invasions or colonization. It can be all kinds of different white rabbits that people follow, but ultimately they find they're in the same great rabbit warren where all these topics join up. And so it was for that reason that when I asked Richard Dolan what got him into the whole subject of ufology and ET contact, his answer surprised me. Richard Dolan is one of the most respected researchers into ufology in the world today, and I think that's because he is so diligent in his filtering of fact from fiction, in his fact testing of the sources that he studies, and he has a very grounded approach to the whole subject. But when I asked him what got him into that area, I was surprised by what he had to tell me.
25 plus years ago, I thought I had a different life path, and that was in the academic world. It was a world that I loved. I enjoyed the lifestyle. I liked the university setting. I got along very well with all of my colleagues and professors. And so that was simply what I thought I would do. But in the early 1990s, the academic world was really starting to disillusion me. I was in my early 30s when I had a conversation with a professor about the JFK assassination. So it's 1994 when I had this conversation, and he had a book in his hand that I had happened to read not long before. It was by a man named Gerald Posner called Case Closed. It was why Oswald supposedly had done it all by himself. And I remembered reading that book on the advice of a friend of mine, and I read it, and I wasn't a JFK expert, but I was able to pick apart why that book was so terrible. And in fact, me being a smart mouth, in the hallway, I'm talking to this professor who's got the book in his hand. He was using it to teach in his class. And I said, "You realize that book's a piece of crap, right?" It's exactly what I said. And he said, "No, really? Why?" And I rattled off about 5 reasons off the top of my head why that book was so terrible. And I'll never forget this moment. He said, "Oh, I understand. You're a conspiracy theorist." As a young academic wanting to be into that world, that was the worst thing he could have said to me. In the movie Lord of the Rings, you remember that in the first episode where Frodo is with his other hobbits and the riders are coming for the first time, and the cinematography, the video is so brilliant, it telescopes out in this surrealistic way. That's how I felt. I felt like I'm on a cliff, and if I take one more step, I'm going to go off that cliff, and my reputation will be ruined in the academic world. I'll never forget it. And we resolved the conversation. We laughed, and I went about my way, but it was chilling for me because I realized I'm in the Department of History. We don't have really a lot of grant money coming from governments. We're pretty much all on our own. We're independent. There's no institutional pressure, at least in theory, on me to pursue my intellectual interests. And yet here I was, and something as mundane as the JFK assassination. And in that department at that time, you were not allowed to discuss something as interesting as the John F. Kennedy assassination. So it was a moment where I realized I don't actually know that I want to be in this culture anymore. So I was going through all of these tribulations and dealing with a dissertation that was interesting me less and less. And then I stumbled into the UFO subject. I was in a bookstore and I saw a copy of Timothy Good's classic Above Top Secret, the Worldwide UFO Cover-Up. And I'll never forget picking the book off the shelf thinking, wow, everyone talks about UFO cover-ups. And for me, I had trained myself to thinking it was all nonsense. But I was curious. I will definitely say that. And I remember leafing through his book thinking, oh, I see these are allegedly genuine documents. And I see this person is in his book. And I remember reading his diaries. And I read all about this department. And wait, what? He's got them in this UFO context. So it was this moment of like what I often call cultural schizophrenia, where you're ensconced in what you realize is this official establishment truth that you're supposed to believe, but here's this other potential truth that's quite radical. And I think I was at the perfect age. I was 31, 32 years old when I threw myself into it. So I was old enough to have a good foundation in my education, but I was still young enough to be to have the energy and to have the guts to throw it all away and to try this something new.
Paleocontact is one of those subjects where you'll often get credentialed experts coming out to challenge writers who venture into this topic. And there can be a bit of a counterplay between the role of the writer and the role of the academic. There is something very conservatizing about the whole approach of peer review. It's a very important aspect of the testing of new ideas. But what it means historically is that the bold new idea will often not come from within the bowels of the mainstream of academia. It will come from the outside. And it's actually the role of the writer to join some dots and say, wait a minute, have you thought about the implications of this? Or to read someone's published research and say, hang on, the implications of this are this, aren't they? And to bring something to the table that may seem very left field, but it then allows the academics to come to the party and talk about it. And in my work with the Fifth Kind TV and writing the books Escaping from Eden and The Scars of Eden, I've had to come to terms with the fact that that is the writer's role, that when I put forward an idea, I will be critiqued by people with PhDs coming out of their ears. But what's curious about the subject of paleocontact is there's such a taboo around it that very often you will find people coming from academia who will say, I have thought what you've thought for a long time. Here are the evidences I have found. They just don't want to be quoted in public. And I was reassured when I met Erich Von Daniken to find it wasn't only me having this experience.
I have received so much information from scientists which definitely prove my case, definitely. With some of them, I have never gone to public. For example, in one of my books, I was discussing about the Maya calendar. The Maya, the culture of Maya in Central America, they had two calendars. One of the Maya calendar has 365 days, like our calendar. The other Maya calendar has 260 days. So this Maya archaeologist explained me that he had similar thoughts. And he said, Eric, between Mars and Jupiter, there is the asteroid belt. If the asteroid belt would once, in a deep past, have been a planet, he would have surrounded the sun in 260 days, like in the Maya calendar. I said, Professor, this is great. I will use this information in my next book. And of course, I will confess that I have the information from you. And he said, no, Eric, please no, do never mention my name. I said, why not? He said, because of my colleague. They would harm me, my reputation, so I lose my job. At that time, he was retired already. So we would lose. So it has to be the outsiders, guys like Erich Von Daniken, who come with this kind of discussion into the scientific community. Then we discuss it. We agree or we disagree. But the idea has to come from the outside.
2021 has been a really interesting year because we've all been looking forward to the Senate briefings. And then the preliminary assessment paper comes out. People had been hoping, some had been hoping, that this would be the moment when the US government would finally come clean and say, we've been in contact for 70 years. And it was that kind of admission that Ed Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, had been campaigning for decades, bearing in mind he was bound by layers of official secrets laws. He was still permitted to say that he believed the US government was in contact with a number of other civilizations, spacefaring civilizations, and that they should come clean. Not the only person campaigning for that kind of disclosure, but certainly one of the highest profile. Would we see this in the June 25 briefings of 2021? Well, no. What we got was a preliminary assessment paper that made a lot of people very angry. Firstly, because the remit was so tight, it was only looking at US cases, and then only US cases reported through defense. So that essentially means only Defense Force witnesses, and then only for the period from 2004 through to the present, so only 17 years worth of data. So even the terms of reference of this initial briefing paper seemed to totally diminish what we were looking at. And yet, even within its pages, the report said that every 6 weeks, US defense activities are interfered with by UFOs, or what we now call UAPs. The report said there was no evidence that the source of these UAPs was covert operations or the covert operations of other nations. Zero evidence for that at all. In other words, we don't know who is flying these craft. So there were some things in there. Once every 6 weeks, that's quite a high rate of occurrences. And so I wondered if this semi-disclosure that came with the paper was part of a policy of soft disclosure, where there's little bits of information leaked out, or where the people who used to hold the authoritative positions are allowed to speak. So we hear from the late Paul Hellyer, the former Minister of Defense for Canada, or Haim Eshed, the former chief of Israel's space security program, a position he held for 27 years as a brigadier general. Or we hear from Alain Juillet, the former chief of French intelligence, or from Chris Mellon, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush. Is the fact that they are allowed to make incredible, far-reaching statements about the contact we're experiencing today, is that fact the sign of a policy of soft disclosure? This was a question I put to Richard Dolan.
What I think is happening is that especially since we've had internet, since really the 90s, things have just exploded. I mean, the UFO subject is a genuinely important subject in this world. And once people had the ability, unfettered, to talk about it through the web, it has had, over time, a strong effect even on the established official culture, so that it's becoming more and more impossible for that establishment to ignore it. Like, it can't be ignored forever. And I think this is what is happening. I think we're seeing enough of a cultural change taking place because of 25 years of relatively open discussion about this subject via the web, that it is having an inevitable effect on the established controlled media that exists. They have to make concessions. This is why the United States Navy is making their concessions, because frankly, the cat's out of the bag anyway. So yeah, I think that's what the whole analogy of toothpaste out of the tube. And I think it's a good thing. It's an inevitable thing. Like, enough cultural change has happened in the past generation that we are seeing some of those effects reflected in the mainstream culture as well.
One of the interesting things about the 2021 paper was that it made clear there is zero evidence that these phenomena are the work of covert ops in the States or covert ops by other nations. And yet, people still bring out the idea that, oh, we don't know who's flying this. It could be the Russians, could be the Chinese. But I put it to Nick Pope that if for one moment the USA had thought that the Tic Tac craft of 2004 were Russia or China in their airspace, the response would have been totally different.
It might have been, but then again, without wanting to go too far down this road, one of the things that you are aware whenever you're putting anything out is that you're not just putting it in front of the American people, you're putting it in front of everyone. So one of the questions with all these statements being made about UFOs at the moment, whether it's the Tic Tac or anything else, is how is this being viewed by political leadership in Moscow and Beijing? So that's always there in your awareness for sure. But it might have been handled different. But as I say, if this is some sort of intelligence operation, then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the message and what's the audience? If this was a part of a government acclimatization program or indoctrination program, perception management, whatever you want to call it, I think you would see a generally consistent message. But you don't. You are not going to get funding for research on this. Well, you might, but you'll get more funding if you play up the threat aspect. And if you throw Russia and China into the equation. And so you say, look, we've got this going on in our airspace. We don't know what it is. Might be Russia, might be China, might be something else. If it's Russia or China, we're in big trouble because they've made a quantum leap, technological advance. If it's something else, well, sure as heck, we need to know about that too.
One of the most carefully studied aspects of contact have been the reports of abduction and abduction for hybridization by Defense Force personnel. And so even though it seems like a really woo-woo section of the subject, it's a section that you cannot ignore as soon as you start looking at documentary evidence and hard data that's been tested and examined. The question I put to Nick Pope.
I knew John Mack quite well, and this was a point he often made. It is ill-advised to just throw something out because you've only got eyewitness testimony for it. So that's where I stand with the abduction phenomenon. Of course, as I said in the intro, it's much more difficult to prove because we don't have things like radar data or MASINT data or FLIR data. And so it's going to be much more difficult to bring in the sorts of defense and intelligence journalists in the media who are now beginning to pay serious attention to the UFO subject. It's still, I don't think they're quite going to touch the abduction side of this yet. Although it's interesting because if you look at the letter that the Defense Intelligence Agency sent Congress shortly after the New York Times broke the story about ATIP, they list 38 technical studies that were done under the ATIP contract. And if you read between the lines of one of the titles, they were certainly looking at the sort of human experience and human effect of this. And we looked at similar things in the Ministry of Defense in an intelligence assessment codenamed Project Condign, where we looked at what we called UAP radiation and human interface. So there are some clues out there, and we know that some of the people who have been working on the ATIP contract, and I'm talking about some of the Bigelow Aerospace people and some of the people associated with that work, have gotten into the business, for example, of looking at blood samples and DNA samples from close encounter witnesses. Now, this is a very ethically and maybe even legally challenging aspect of all this, but it's out there, and at some point we are going to have to get into that.
But why would an extraterrestrial civilization have any interest in planet Earth, in human beings, and why any interest in hybridizing with human beings. Now, this is a report that is there in the ancestral narratives of cultures from all around the world. But why would an advanced species want to hybridize with a less advanced species? Barbara Lamb suggests there could be a number of reasons. Now, Barbara Lamb is a licensed psychotherapist. She's been involved in child and family therapy for more than 40 years, and she has honed the study approaches that were really championed by Professor John Mack, who was Harvard's head of clinical psychology. So I asked Barbara Lamb, why would ETs want to hybridize with human beings?
Oh, such a great question. A lot of that has come up in the work that I've done starting back in the very, very early 1990s. Sometimes the extraterrestrials during a regression would give reasons for why they were creating the hybrids. All in all, there were about 15 reasons that were given to my clients on different occasions from these extraterrestrial beings. And they really made sense, at least to me. The main reason that happened the most frequently is that those species of extraterrestrials who were creating hybrids, they had come to a point where they realized that their species was having very great difficulty in reproducing the next generation. So therefore, their civilization of beings was in the process of slowly dying out. And they wanted to rescue their species. So they realized that they had to combine with some other kind of species in order to survive. Another species that would be doing pretty well, like human beings on the whole are doing pretty well. So by that time they had discovered planet Earth and the human civilization, and they had gotten to, from afar, know a lot about humans, and they liked some of our characteristics to blend with for themselves. They liked the fact, and they were very puzzled by it as well, the fact of our emotions, because most of those species are very low in the component of emotion or have no emotional reactions at all. They're just not constructed that way. And they have noticed that humans have a whole variety of emotions, and that it makes life very interesting, very colorful, and even very creative. They respect, many of them, that we humans have a whole panoply of artistic expressions that we engage in, all of the arts and music and so forth, and that life is very stimulating and very interesting for us humans compared to theirs, which is in many cases much more matter-of-fact and not emotional. So that's one of the features. Also, many of the beings have a much more frail, slim body form and a weaker body form, very, very astute and developmentally, but with sort of smaller, slimmer, weaker bodies. So one of the things about humans that they like and want to combine with is our more robust physical bodies, whether we're heavier or slimmer or whatever. We just have stronger physical constitutions. So many of these beings think that it would be a great advantage to create these hybrids, which are partly their race and partly ours. One of the reasons given, and I love this reason, given for the hybridization, is that some of these species would like to create beings who are part them and part us in order to be ambassadors able to go to their planets and their civilizations because of the extraterrestrial component in them, and also human enough to come to our planet and bring news about that other civilization.
This account of abduction for hybridization really is global. You can hear these stories in Africa, the Caribbean, the Philippines, India, the Norse countries, Europe, Celtic countries, and the detail with which the stories repeat is really quite phenomenal. And since there are people to this day who report contact experiences, and some very brave souls who say they believe it's because there's a hybridization program going on, we often startle as if we'd never heard the like before, and yet that story is ages old. So how prevalent are these experiences? Richard Dolan.
The hybridization program, the program to extract genetic material from us, I think is probably very widespread. So that could mean a lot of people contributing to the program. That could have been yourself.
I think there are millions of people in the United States alone, and more millions of people worldwide who have been having these encounter experiences. And they probably know just a little bit about it and certainly wonder about it, maybe are quite troubled about it. Most people just remember the first few moments of beings being there and not understanding it. And then you see the beings have a way of what we call switching us off. And if you happen to be with somebody else, for instance, somebody else in your bed at night when these beings come, or somebody else in the car with you, or wherever you are when this begins, that other person is very deeply switched off. In other words, there'd be no way you could possibly awaken or get the attention of that other person. So it seems like the companion is switched off first, while the person might be aware of beings being there, or a light coming in from the window if they're in their bedroom at night, or a light following the car if they're driving along at night, or even in the daytime. And so the companion is usually switched off out of consciousness, not harmed in any way, and that's important, but just made to be not conscious. And then the person who's going to have the experience is aware of just a tiny bit, just 2 or 3 moments of whatever is happening, and then they too are switched off or made to be out of consciousness. And that's why they don't remember what happened. Now, occasionally I meet someone who says, oh, I just have this image of being on a whole different environment. It seems like a ship of some sort, and I have the image of my being on the table and something doing something to my head, or some unusual beings standing around me. They might not remember the beginning of the experience, but they have a little flashback of 1 or 2 or 3 of the moments of the experience.
Another strange phenomenon Barbara Lamb talks about in her more than 2,000 case studies of people retrieving memories of close encounters is that following the close encounters, people often experience heightened cognitive performance or heightened cognitive abilities. Suddenly they can do things they could not before. They experience heightened telepathic connection, or they experience precognition. And this was the experience of an Argentinian farmer by the name of Juan Perez. And he's the subject of the beautiful movie by Alan Stivelman, Witness of Another World. I was very privileged to ask Juan about this precognition experience.
Tenía sueños y se me hacían realidad. One of the things that I usually experienced after the encounter was that I had some dreams. And those dreams became real. Between my 14 and 15 years old, I realized that what I dreamed came true later. However, nowadays I know how to control them. For instance, last weekend I went to a lecture, and when I fell asleep, I dreamed that I was going to have a quiet travel, and it was a total change. This was 3 days ago. It's very strange what happened, because I asked for a ticket, and the lady who was handing them out gave me not the one that I asked for. She gave me another one, and that's why I took another bus.
When people experience these heightened cognitive abilities, whether it's through a contact experience or through an injury, and I study this in the topic of acquired Savant syndrome. I talk about this in Escaping from Eden. And once you realize that there is this syndrome that is studied by credentialed neuroscientists around the world, where you can suffer an injury to the brain and it accidentally switches off inhibitors in the brain so that you're suddenly able to do brilliant mathematics or understand the physical structure of everything you're looking at, or have an ability in language you didn't have before, or be able to play a musical instrument you couldn't play before. This is a baffling phenomenon, and scientists studying it ask the very reasonable question, can we turn these abilities up without having to suffer an injury? And so you get very quickly into questions of consciousness. Now, our ancestral narratives give an explanation as to why there would be latent abilities in our brains that are more advanced than what we generally engage with, but they're in the off position. And I talk about what those ancestral stories are in my books, The Scars of Eden and Escaping from Eden. But right here, right now, are we able to heighten our consciousness in a way that's really grounded and testable? Here's filmmaker Caroline Cory.
Of course, I totally believe in the entanglement theory. It's not even a theory, it's actually been proven and demonstrated scientifically. But in terms of consciousness, it's still a theory because, we can't actually measure consciousness itself. We can measure the effects of consciousness on the physical world. And so when one of the experiments, we record a voice on a tape recorder, and then we play it back on another tape recorder that wasn't plugged in. How is it possible that the voice could be transferred when the second tape recorder didn't even have batteries in it? It explains so many things. It explains how someone could have a feeling, a mother could have a feeling that something's happening to her son on the other side of the planet. And it's because it's a natural process, a natural phenomenon. She's tapping into his energy. She's seeing him, something happening to him. And so how does that work? It's all remote viewing, And so I definitely wanted to explore that. Also, especially that the governments were running programs, for the longest time, training soldiers to remote view, of course, for military purposes, granted, but still, this means that they were taking it very seriously.
I've actually seen this myself. My kids did some of the training with Caroline Cory, and I was blown away by what my kids were able to see totally blindfolded. And in the very first session, my 5-year-old was reading a book he'd never read before while blindfolded. So I know that we are able to see with something other than our eyes, that somehow the body is able to use perhaps its electromagnetic field to download information in the electromagnetic field of our environment or even of the planet. And that gives me some kind of a framework to get how we might be able to do things like remote viewing, something in which governments around the world have invested serious money for hundreds of years. Queen Elizabeth I employed John Dee to develop the remote viewing department that evolved into MI5. We now know that from the 1970s to the 1990s, the CIA was funding programs to investigate and develop remote viewing. And it's for the same reasons that countries always want to know what their enemies and allies are doing and thinking. How does it work, though? Are we simply downloading from the field, or is there more to it? Downloading from the field is one thing if you're looking at remote viewing or a telepathic connection, which is about a present-to-present connection. Even more mystifying is when people start speaking things that will happen in the future and they come to pass. And this was Lionel Friedberg's first experience of the Southern African Sangomas back in the 1960s.
I was living in northern Rhodesia at the time, which was a British colony, and Britain was giving all its colonies away. They were all getting independence. And so northern Rhodesia was slated to become Zambia in 1964. I'd been working, this was the first television station in Central Africa, and it was an extraordinary experience because we did programming for local vernacular languages for local tribes. And at night we catered to basically a copper mining white audience. So we lived in many worlds in the station, but when independence came and we became Zambia, the station was nationalized. It was originally privately owned. And when we were nationalized, we all got little pink slips from the government to say, thank you very much, you've done a wonderful job, but bye-bye, in 6 months' time, you have to leave. You've got to give your job over to a local person, which we all totally understood. It made total sense. None of us argued with the concept of that. But my big problem was, what was I going to do now? My dream was always to go to Hollywood and work in this town where I live in now and make films, because I was a film fanatic, a movie fanatic. And I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. So I said to this guy who worked for us at home, a Bemba man, a member of the Bemba ethnic group, I said, David, I really don't know what to do. I don't want to go back to South Africa, which, by the way, had a fairly thriving film industry even at that time. What should I do? I really want to go and live in America and work in Hollywood and all that. And he said, I will find someone who may help you. And I said, like whom? And he said, trust me. And I did. I implicitly trusted him. So came the day. There was David and I trundling into the bush in my little blue VW Beetle on this little dirt road. We went to an outskirts outside a town called Dolan, out in the boondocks, of course. And on the edge of this was a single house. And David said, that's the place we go to, right there. And park your car right there. And I had no idea who or what we were in for. And he knocked at the door, and this little old woman opened the door, hunched over. It was a piping hot day, and she was covered up in a coat, whatever else. She had a skin pigment problem. She was a member of the Bemba group, but she had a skin pigment problem, so she was an albino. And wrinkled up and, extremely old. And she beckoned us into her little house. She spoke no English whatsoever. And she told us to sit down on the floor, which we did. David next to me, he was going to translate. She was, in Zambia, they call them Ngangas. In South Africa, they call them Sangomas, which is another word for a traditional healer. These people do many, many things. They diagnose illnesses. They can find missing persons. They can foretell the future. They can prescribe medication. And everything is done. The paradigm in Africa is it's all done with the help of the ancestors, of the ancestral spirits. The very first thing that happened was that she pulled back as though she was blinded by a light. And she said to David, she sort of covered her eyes and she said, what are these bright lights in my eyes? The minute she said that, I knew that she wasn't fooling. She was for real. I'd better pay attention to what she had to say because she'd seen the lights in the television station where I was working. So I thought, you'd better pay attention to what this woman has to say to you. And for the next hour or however long it was, there was this endless amount of information that she gave me. David was trying very, very hard to keep up with her, and I was trying to keep some notes. She told me the most extraordinary things. And every single one of those major events that she foretold came true over the next 60 years.
Some people's anomalous encounters, whether it's with ETs or other kinds of entity, involve downloads of information like that. But what's the purpose of them? Is it to bring information? Is it to heighten our intelligence? Is it to bring us a warning? If we go to the 1990s, to Rua in Zimbabwe, we find a school in Ariel where a group of school children had a close encounter. Filmmaker James Fox met and interviewed a number of the students involved in this encounter, and I asked him about people's reaction to that case.
To listen to the children, 66 of them went on camera. There were 100 in the field at the time, because I went there. And to hear their story, it's so profoundly moving. My partner, Rebecca, she has no interest. We don't talk about UFOs ever. And one day, I don't even think I called her over. I was in the house editing in my room or something, and she came in and just happened to look and saw the children being interviewed about that sighting, and she stopped. She went, "Oh my gosh, this is incredible. Those children aren't lying. This is the most amazing thing I've ever seen." I've had teachers look at this, psychologists look at this. Everyone is like, those kids are telling the truth. There's no question in my mind, not a shadow of doubt. And then to hear from them 20 years later, and they remember it like it was yesterday. They described to me at the time when they were adults. They said, "James, our school playground had these big logs at the outer perimeter. And those logs were there to define, like, okay, this is as far as you're allowed to go, because after that, the fields were not mowed and maintained, and there were dangerous spiders and snakes and stuff. And so the children were not allowed to go beyond those logs. But being children, what they would do is, of course, go all the way out to the logs, and then they'd skip along the logs. During the encounter, a couple of the witnesses explained to me that these beings, some of them say there was one, many of them say there was more than one, were merrily and joyfully dancing along with the children as they skipped on the logs. And then they said, James, if you've ever been out in the wild and you have an encounter with a very rare encounter with an animal, there's this standoff, this moment of mystery and curiosity and intrigue. And almost like time stops. And they said that's what it was like with these creatures. They were just as curious in us as we were in them.
The red pill that opened up this whole topic for me was hermeneutics. For decades, I'd been involved in training pastors in the interpretation of ancient texts, and the Bible in particular. And I come to hermeneutics with a background in languages. I was very fortunate in school to learn German, French, Latin, went on to study Italian, Portuguese, New Testament Greek. And so it's with the linguistic questions that I come to ancient texts. And when I come to a text and I want to know how to interpret it, I have trained pastors to do a number of things. And the first is to ask, what kind of literature am I looking at? And that's called form analysis or form criticism. And then to ask, where did this story come from? What's the source? And how does it differ from the source story? That's called source analysis or source criticism. And then, because I'm a linguist, I always want to know, what do the words mean? And it was all those questions that got me into the topic of paleocontact, because source analysis, it turns out that the stories of beginnings in the Bible are based on stories of extraterrestrial beings that were curated by the Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and Assyrian cultures, from which the stories of beginnings emanate, that now have become Genesis 1 to 11 and other stories on into the Hebrew canon in the Old Testament. Erich Von Daniken argues there are probably 10 key words in that canon of literature that if you go back to the root meanings, the whole meaning of the story changes and the whole aspect of paleocontact becomes impossible to miss. So just as for me, Erich Von Daniken's journey into the whole question of paleocontact began with theology and the translation of texts in the Bible.
I was educated as a strict Catholic, and my father sent me into a Swiss Catholic boarding school, which was led by Jesuits. And in that school, we have to make translations of some parts of the Bible from Latin to Greek and from Greek to German. Now, I was a deep, deep believer in God. By the way, I still am a very deep believer in God. But my God had to have some qualities. For example, my God had to be all over. He would never use a vehicle in which to move from point A to point B, because God is omnipotent, or God is out of time, God is a spiritual being, etc., etc. Now, while translating these books, I read, for example, in the first book of Moses, before the Lord of the Bible descends to the holy mountain, he gives order to Moses to construct a gate around the mountain so that the Israelites would not come close by, otherwise they would be destroyed. So Moses constructs the gate. The Israelites are in safe distance, and then the Lord descends with smoke and fire and trembling, loud noise. In the Bible it even says the mountain looked like a furnace. Now I said to myself, as a 14-year-old boy, why does God, the real God, the spiritual God, first need a gate for protection? God is omnipotent. Why this distance? Why would he say they would be destroyed if they would be closed? So I simply had doubts in my own education. And I wanted to find out if other communities in antiquity have similar stories as we learned in the Bible. That was the beginning for Chariots of the Gods. You know, the college in which I was studying had a direct connection with the library of the university in the city of Fribourg in Switzerland. So I just had to go to the next door, and I was in the library. And the leader of the library was a Jesuit too. And I told him, your brother told to me I should ask you for the book of Enoch. And he asked me, what do you want to know about Enoch? I said, everything. I know nothing about Enoch. So I received the book of Enoch. Of course, I studied the Enoch in 2 languages. And it's very, very fascinating. Now we have no time to recover the whole Enoch story. But the main thing is, Enoch was taken up to the sky. In religion, they say he was taken up to heaven. There he goes into he travels or sees some garden. In the religion, they say, well, he's in the garden of the paradise. In my eyes, no, he's not in the garden of the paradise. He's in a mother spaceship and in a plantation of a mother spaceship. Then he comes to the highest, the room where the highest was sitting. And the highest said, hello. He welcomed Enoch and 2 others. Now I said, my God would never welcome first the human from earth. In religion, they said it was the Almighty God. So I said, no, it was not the Almighty God. It was the commander of a spaceship. So anyhow, I saw different things in Enoch with my eyes. Of course, we discussed all this with the professor. Of course, they had other explanations, reasonable explanations from the religious point of view, from psychology, and so on. But I was still curious, and I continued with other books, like you've just mentioned, Mahabharata, or the Tanchur from Tibet, and so. And I always came together with similar stories. Some gods, so-called gods, descended. They teach some of the humans, not everyone, just a few of them. And they teach them, and these teachers went back to the humans, and they became the teacher of mankind at that time. So the story repeats. And before these so-called gods disappeared, they always promised to the humans, we will return.
If paleocontact is true, and for me that leads immediately to questions of human potential and human consciousness and how we live more intelligently on the planet. If paleocontact is true, and if we can heighten our intelligence and our consciousness, then What do we have to gain from that realization? This was a question I put to Gaia's Matthew LaCroix.
All of this stuff is real. All of this stuff is just sitting there waiting for humanity to decide to wake up and pay attention. Because if each one of us decided to reach these higher states of consciousness and energy, it would change everything here. And so most people go along with these distractions and these things that come along in our reality that hold us back, and they'll just sail through life with them. And then by the time they die, they're wondering, what did I do with my life? You know, what was I doing? I regret so many things. Even though these decisions seem like I have no choice, I always have choice based on free will. Everything that I decide to do is going to be a factor in how my life turns out. So wait a minute. So what if I eat some healthy vegetables or fruits or a piece of healthy fish? What does that do internally to my vibration versus some of these really bad foods? Those are those first steps that people take in recognizing that, wow, these things really affect my state. They really affect my conscious state and how I'm connected to understanding all these things around me. And when you start doing that, if each one of us decided to reach these higher states of consciousness and energy, we would essentially co-create our own reality.
When you take any red pill that opens up the world of Paleocontact, an awful lot changes. Your understanding of who we are as a species changes. Your understanding of religious history changes. Your understanding of history, geopolitics. And in fact, in the Scars of Eden, I argue that it's impossible to understand today's geopolitics or the history of wars, invasions, assassinations, so on and so forth, without an appreciation that Paleocontact is in the roots of our experience as a species. And that can seem like quite a dark rabbit hole to go down. But where my research has led me is actually to a place of appetite and excitement, because I realize that our potential as human beings is so much greater than that with which we generally engage. And understanding that we are all hybrids, that we are part Earthling and part ET, that we're part of a much bigger cosmic family, that we have the interest and attention of our wider family, some who are indifferent to us, some who might treat us in ways we would perceive as cold or cruel, and others who are actually very nurturing towards Project Humanity, very nurturing towards us as beings. For me, the possibility opens up that we can have a better experience in the cosmos, on our planet, and as a human society. If we can switch on our latent abilities, if we can be more intelligent and conscious and loving as a society of human beings living on planet Earth, then the sky's the limit, so to speak. I want to know how we can live more conscious, more intelligent, more loving on planet Earth and have a better human experience. And it's to those questions that I'm led by all the questions of Paleocontact. I love the company that I keep on this journey. I keep meeting people all around the world with research and experiences through which we're able to encourage one another and peel back, to use Neil Armstrong's phrase, another of truth's protective layers, and begin to perceive the amazing cosmos that we live in.